He only wanted to move houses, but found the person who would change his destiny. Hello, let's start another beautiful story. Welcome to my channel. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Let's go. Ethan Carter stood in his emptying penthouse apartment, methodically checking off items from his moving checklist. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors. Everything was proceeding according to plan, or so he thought. His phone buzzed, unknown number. "Mr. Carter?" A woman's voice, slightly breathless. "I think there's been a mix-up with your moving boxes." Ethan's grip tightened on his phone. "Excuse me, I'm Lily Bennett. The moving company just delivered what I assume are your boxes to my house. Unless you're also an architect who collects minimalist art and has an impressive collection of business suits." He closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. This wasn't part of the plan. None of this was supposed to happen. The moving company had stellar reviews, a meticulous tracking system, and "Mr. Carter, are you still there?" "Yes. Sorry." He pinched the bridge of his nose. "This is completely unacceptable. I'll contact the moving company immediately and—" "Actually," Lily interrupted, "I was thinking it might be easier if you just came by to sort through them yourself. Some boxes are already opened. My daughter Sophie got a bit curious. She's quite impressed with your architectural sketches, by the way." Ethan's carefully constructed schedule for the day began to crumble. "Your daughter opened my boxes." A slight pause. "She's 6. And in her defense, the box was labeled fragile in big red letters. You know how kids are with reverse psychology." No, he didn't know how kids were with anything. Children weren't part of his carefully structured world of deadlines, client meetings, and precise measurements. "I can be there in 30 minutes, he said, already pulling up his GPS. "What's the address?" As Lily rattled off directions to her place in the artsy district of town, Ethan found himself growing increasingly annoyed. This neighborhood was exactly what he'd been trying to escape. All those bohemian cafes, street art, and general unpredictability. "Look for the yellow craftsman with blue shutters," Lily added. "You can't miss it. There's a rather large metal sculpture of a dragon in the front yard. I made it last spring." Of course she did. 28 minutes later, Ethan pulled up to the house. The dragon sculpture caught the morning light, casting whimsical shadows across the wild, flowering front yard. The whole scene was chaos to his ordered mind. Mismatched flowers growing wherever they pleased, wind chimes tinkling from the porch, and what appeared to be a child's art gallery taped to the front windows. Before he could reach the front door, it burst open. A small whirlwind with curly brown hair and missing front teeth came bounding out. "Are you the architect?" the little girl demanded, skidding to a stop in front of him. "I'm Sophie. I love your drawings. Can you teach me how to make buildings look real like that? Mum says I have to ask before keeping other people's stuff." "Sophie," a woman appeared in the doorway, early 30s, paint-splattered jeans, dark hair twisted up with what appeared to be a paintbrush stuck through it. "What did we say about personal space?" "That it's important unless you're giving hugs to people you love," Sophie recited, then looked up at Ethan hopefully. "Do you like hugs?" Ethan found himself at a loss for words, something that hadn't happened since his last project presentation in architecture school. "Sophie, honey, let Mr. Carter breathe," Lily said, coming down the porch steps. She extended her hand to Ethan, her smile warm but slightly apologetic. "I'm Lily. Sorry about the chaos. And come on in. Your boxes are in the living room." Ethan followed them inside, immediately noticing more evidence of artistic expression everywhere. Half-finished sculptures, canvases in various stages of completion, and what appeared to be a massive mosaic project spreading across one wall. His boxes sat in neat stacks by the fireplace, looking strangely out of place with their precise labels and organizational system. "Sophie, why don't you go finish your breakfast?" Lily suggested. "Mr. Carter and I need to sort this out." "But Mom, Cheerios are getting soggy as we speak." Sophie sighed dramatically but trudged toward the kitchen, turning back to wave at Ethan. Don't leave before I show you my drawings, okay? Before Ethan could respond, she was gone, leaving him alone with Lily and the uncomfortable awareness that his perfectly planned day was veering wildly off course. I apologize again for the mix-up, Lily said, gesturing to the boxes. And for Sophie's enthusiasm, she's been especially interested in architecture since... She paused, something flickering across her face. Well, she's just curious about everything these days. Ethan noticed the wedding ring she wore, but also the absence of any male presence in the house. He pushed the observation aside, focusing on the task at hand. It's fine. I'll just quickly check that everything's here and arrange for immediate pickup. No rush, Lily said, watching as he knelt to examine the first box. Sophie's actually doing me a favor. Her excitement over your drawings finally got her interested in something besides asking questions about... She stopped again, that same shadow crossing her features. Ethan found himself looking up, caught by the mixture of strength and vulnerability in her expression. For a moment, the carefully constructed walls he'd built around himself wavered. Then Sophie's voice rang out from the kitchen. "Mom, the milk's empty again." "Duty calls," Lily said with a small laugh. "Take your time with the boxes. We'll be in the kitchen if you need anything." As she walked away, Ethan tried to focus on his checklist, on his schedule, on all the perfectly reasonable reasons he needed to get out of this house as quickly as possible. But his eyes kept drifting to the architectural sketches Sophie had carefully spread out on the coffee table, arranged with the same care he usually reserved for client presentations. For the first time in years, Ethan Carter's ordered world felt like it might be about to change, and he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to stop it. The following week found Ethan sitting in his new apartment, surrounded by perfectly arranged furniture and unopened boxes. Everything was exactly where it should be, yet something felt off. His eyes kept drifting to a crumpled piece of paper on his otherwise immaculate coffee table, a crayon drawing of what appeared to be his dragon-guarded architectural office, signed in wobbly letters from Sophie. He'd discovered it tucked between his sketches when unpacking. Despite his usual fastidiousness about keeping his workspace clean, he couldn't bring himself to throw it away. His phone chimed with a message from David. "Client meeting tomorrow. Hope you're settled in and ready to focus. This could be our biggest project yet." Ethan typed a quick confirmation, then found himself opening his photos, scrolling to the pictures he'd taken of his sketches at Lily's house. He'd wanted to document any potential damage, but instead, he kept focusing on how she'd arranged them on her wall, not chronologically or by project type as he would have, but in a way that somehow told a story. She'd seen something in his work that he hadn't. The memory of her standing there, explaining her interpretation of his designs, made something twist in his chest. "You capture the way light changes everything," she'd said, gesturing to his latest project. It's not just about the structure. You understand how people move through spaces, how they feel in them." A knock at his door startled him from the memory. Opening it, he found his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, looking distressed. "Mr. Carter, I hate to bother you, but there's water leaking from somewhere above your apartment into mine. The building manager isn't answering." Ethan grabbed his tools and followed her downstairs. As he examined the leak, he found himself thinking about Lily's own housing situation. She'd mentioned something about her lease while he was packing up his boxes, her voice carefully casual, but her tension visible. "Thank you," Mrs. Rodriguez said as he finished the temporary fix. "You remind me of my late husband. He could always figure out how to make things work." Back in his apartment, Ethan tried to focus on tomorrow's client presentation. Instead, he found himself researching the property management company that owned Lily's building. His fingers hesitated over the keyboard before typing out an email to an old colleague who owed him a favor. The next morning, Ethan arrived early at his office, determined to concentrate, but as he set up his presentation materials, his mind kept wandering to Sophie's drawing. The way she saw buildings, not as mere structures, but as spaces filled with possibility and adventure, reminded him of why he'd fallen in love with architecture in the first place. Earth to Ethan David's voice cut through his thoughts. His business partner stood in the doorway, impeccably dressed and radiating impatience. "The clients will be here in 20 minutes. Tell me you're ready?" "Of course." Ethan straightened his tie, pushing thoughts of whimsical dragons and artistic interpretations aside. This was his world. Clean lines, clear objectives, measurable outcomes. The meeting went perfectly until it didn't. As Ethan presented their design for the new corporate headquarters, he found himself questioning details he'd never second-guessed before. Would the atrium really invite connection, or just look impressive in photos? Had they considered how the afternoon light would affect the workspace? "Is everything all right?" David asked afterward, frowning. "You seemed distracted." "Just tired from the move," Ethan replied, gathering his materials. His phone buzzed, an email from his contact about Lily's building. The news wasn't good. Before he could stop himself, he was dialing Lily's number, saved from their box mix-up conversation. Hello." Her voice was strained, the sound of power tools in the background. "It's Ethan Carter. I hope I'm not interrupting." "Just trying to fix a broken pipe in my studio. Apparently, my landlord's solution to maintenance requests is to ignore them until the problem goes away. Or the tenant does." The bitterness in her voice was new. "Actually, that's why I'm calling. I think I might have a solution. Could we meet?" A pause. "I don't need saving, Mr. Carter." "Ethan," he corrected automatically. "And I'm not trying to save you. I'm trying to return a favor. Sophie's drawing gave me some ideas for the project I'm working on." Another pause, longer this time. Then, "The pipes can wait an hour. There's a cafe around the corner from my studio. The Bean Counter." "I know it," he said, though he'd only ever walked past it, dismissing it as too eclectic for his tastes. "And Sophie will be with me," Lily added, a hint of challenge in her voice. "Good," Ethan replied, surprising himself with how much he meant it. "I'd like to thank her for the artwork." As he hung up, David appeared in his doorway again. "We need to discuss the timeline for the new project." "Dinner." "Can't. I have a meeting about a different property." David's eyebrows rose. "Since when do you take on side projects?" "Since a box mix-up turned my perfectly ordered life upside down," Ethan thought. Out loud, he said, "I'm just exploring some options." As he gathered his things to leave, Ethan caught his reflection in the window. For the first time in years, the man staring back at him looked less like a successful architect and more like someone on the verge of building something entirely new, something that couldn't be captured in blueprints or measured in square feet. He straightened his tie one last time, then deliberately loosened it. Some meetings, he was beginning to learn, required a different kind of precision altogether. The Bean Counter was exactly the kind of place Ethan typically avoided. Mismatched vintage furniture, local art covering every wall, and the distinctly bohemian aroma of coffee beans and creativity. Yet, as he pushed open the door, the warm atmosphere struck him as oddly welcoming. Sophie spotted him first. "Mr. Carter, Mom, look, he came." She bounced in her seat, colored pencils scattered across the table in front of her. Another architectural masterpiece in progress, he presumed. Lily looked up from her phone, and something in her expression made him pause. Her usual easy smile was strained, her eyes shadowed. "Thanks for coming," she said, quickly tucking her phone away. "Though I'm still not sure why you're involving yourself in my housing situation." Before he could respond, Sophie thrust a paper at him. "Look what I made. It's your building, but with a garden on every floor. Mom says real buildings can't have that many trees, but you could figure it out, right? Because you're magic with buildings." Ethan found himself smiling as he studied the drawing. Actually, vertical gardens are becoming more common in modern architecture. They help regulate temperature, improve air quality. He caught himself slipping into lecture mode, but Sophie was nodding enthusiastically. "See, Mom, Mr. Carter gets it." She turned back to her drawing, adding what appeared to be a family of birds to one of the garden levels. "Sophie, honey, why don't you go ask Mrs. Rosa for your hot chocolate?" Lily suggested, sliding some money across the table. After Sophie skipped off to the counter, she fixed Ethan with a direct look. "You didn't come here to discuss my daughter's architectural innovations." "No," he admitted, pulling out his tablet. "I did some research on your building's management company. They've been cited multiple times for code violations, and they're likely going to lose their permit for the artist studios within the next month." Lily's face paled slightly, but her voice remained steady. "I was afraid of that, hence the ignored maintenance requests. Why fix what you're planning to condemn?" She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "I've been looking for other spaces, but everything in my price range is either too small for a studio or not suitable for Sophie," she finished quietly. "After Ben died, I promised myself I'd keep things stable for her. She's already lost so much." The mention of her late husband hung in the air between them. Ethan found himself wanting to reach across the table to offer some kind of comfort, but his natural reserve held him back. That's actually why I wanted to meet," he said instead, swiping through his tablet. "I recently completed a mixed-use development project downtown. The ground floor was designed for creative spaces. Good light, high ceilings. One of the units is still available." Lily's eyes narrowed. "I checked those spaces when they first opened. They're way outside my budget. The management company owes me a favor. They're willing to offer a reduced rate for the first year, with an option to renew at a fixed increase." He slid the tablet toward her, showing the details. "It's a legitimate business arrangement, not charity." She stared at the screen, then at him. "Why would you do this?" "Because—" Ethan hesitated, realizing he wasn't entirely sure himself. "Because sometimes good design isn't just about the building. It's about the people who bring it to life." Sophie returned then, hot chocolate topped with a mountain of whipped cream. "Mom, Ms. Rosa says we should come to the art fair next weekend. Can we, please?" She looked at Ethan. "You should come too. Mom's going to have a booth. She makes the most amazing sculptures, but she says no one important will notice." "Sophie," Lily warned, but Ethan was already pulling out his phone. "And actually, I know several gallery owners who might be interested in new artists. I could invite them to the fair." "Mr. Carter, Ethan," Lily corrected herself. "You don't have to." "I know." He met her gaze steadily. "But I'd like to." A splash of hot chocolate interrupted the moment, as Sophie's enthusiasm got the better of her coordination. As they all reached for napkins, Lily's hand brushed against Ethan's. The brief contact sent an unexpected current through him, and from the way she quickly withdrew, he suspected she'd felt it too. "Sorry," Sophie said, though her grin suggested otherwise. "Mom says I'm like a hurricane sometimes, but she also says hurricanes can bring good changes." Lily laughed softly, the tension breaking. "I'm pretty sure that's not quite what I said." She looked at the tablet again, then at Ethan. "The studio space. I'd need to think about it." "Of course." He stood, straightening papers that didn't need straightening. "Take your time. The offer won't expire." As he turned to leave, Sophie called out, "Wait! You forgot your drawing!" She pressed the garden-filled skyscraper into his hands. "Put it somewhere important, okay?" Later that night, as Ethan sat in his perfectly organized home office, he found himself looking at Sophie's drawing again. Next to it, he placed the rental agreement for the studio space, the one he'd spent his afternoon negotiating instead of preparing for tomorrow's client meeting. His phone lit up with another message from David. "Need those revision specs by morning? Everything okay?" Ethan looked at the drawing again, at the impossible gardens growing between precise architectural lines. For the first time in his career, he wasn't sure what okay meant anymore. But as he began working on the revisions, he found himself incorporating elements he would have dismissed as impractical just weeks ago. Spaces that emphasized connection over efficiency, beauty over function. And somewhere between the lines of steel and glass, he could almost see a family of birds making their home. The week before, the art fair brought unseasonably heavy rain to the city, matching David's mood as he paced Ethan's office. "You've completely redesigned the central atrium. 2 days before the client presentation, he tossed the revised plans onto Ethan's desk. "What's gotten into you?" Ethan studied the designs spread before him. The new layout featured a series of interconnected spaces that flowed organically into each other, with planters integrated into the structure. "It's more sustainable, more human-centered. The original design was perfect for what the client asked for," David interrupted. "Corporate, clean, impressive. Since when do you care about urban gardens and community spaces?" "Since a 6-year-old showed me what my buildings were missing," Ethan thought. Out loud, he said, "The market's changing. People want buildings that feel alive, not just look impressive. People want whatever we tell them they want." David leaned against the desk. "Look, I get it. Everyone goes through a phase where they question their direction, but we have contracts to fulfill, deadlines to meet." A knock at the door saved Ethan from responding. His assistant peeked in. "Mr. Carter, there's a call from the Bean Counter Cafe. They say it's urgent." Ethan's heart jumped. He'd been meeting Lily and Sophie there every other day, supposedly to discuss the studio space, but mostly to watch Sophie design increasingly elaborate garden buildings while he and Lily talked about everything and nothing. "I need to take this," he said, already reaching for the phone. David's expression darkened. "We're not finished here." But Ethan was already answering the call. "This is Ethan Carter." "Mr. Carter?" It was Rosa, the cafe owner. "You should come. There's been a flood at Mrs. Bennett's studio. She's here with Sophie, but—" She lowered her voice. "She's trying to be strong for her daughter, but all her work for the art fair." "I'm on my way." He grabbed his coat, already mentally cataloguing contractors he could call. "Seriously," David blocked his path. "You're walking out in the middle of a workday for some artist." Something in Ethan snapped. "Her name is Lily." "And yes, I am." The rain had intensified by the time he reached the cafe. Through the window, he saw Sophie sitting at their usual table, determinedly working on a drawing while Lily spoke on her phone, her free hand pressed against her forehead. The bell chimed as he entered, and Sophie's head shot up. "Mr. Carter, Mum's sculptures are swimming." "And not in a good way, like fish." Lily ended her call, and the look she gave him made his chest ache. Equal parts gratitude and embarrassment. "You didn't have to come. I just needed to use the cafe's Wi-Fi to contact the insurance company." "How bad is it?" "The pipe finally gave up completely. Everything in the basement studio is—" She swallowed hard. "The art fair is in 3 days. Can I see?" The studio was worse than he'd imagined. Water pooled ankle deep, and the smell of rust and mildew filled the air. Lily's sculptures, a series of delicate wire and metal pieces that caught light like frozen rain, lay scattered and damaged. "The real estate agent called while I was dealing with this," Lily said quietly, picking up a twisted piece of metal. "Another rejection. Apparently, having a child makes me a liability tenant." She tried to laugh, but it came out more like a sob. "I'm running out of options, Ethan." Before he could stop himself, he reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. "What about Mr. Carter's building?" Sophie asked from the doorway, where Rosa was trying unsuccessfully to keep her dry. "The one with the magic gardens." Lily tensed. "Sophie, honey, I told you." "Take it," Ethan said softly. "Please, no strings attached, no expectations. Just take it. I can't—" "Mom." Sophie splashed into the studio, ignoring Rosa's protests. "Remember what Dad always said? Sometimes you have to let the sun help the flowers grow." Lily's breath caught. Ethan felt her fingers tighten around his briefly before she let go. "Ben used to say that whenever I was being stubborn about accepting help," she explained, wiping her eyes, "he was annoyingly good at being right." "Smart man," Ethan said, earning a watery smile. "The deposit can wait until after the art fair." He surveyed the damage again, "which is still happening, by the way. I know some people who can help us salvage what we can, and my building has an empty retail space we can use temporarily." "Us?" Lily raised an eyebrow. "Well, I do have some experience with spaces." He gestured around the flooded studio, "though usually they're a bit drier." Sophie tugged on his sleeve, her shoes making squelching sounds. "Does this mean we get to make a new art garden?" Can I help design it? Looking at her hopeful face, then at Lily's gradual surrender to the inevitable, Ethan made a decision that would have been unthinkable a month ago. I'll clear my schedule for the next 3 days. We can start moving things as soon as the emergency cleanup crew arrives. His phone buzzed. David, probably about to explode over the missed client meeting. Ethan silenced it without looking. You don't have to do this, Lily said again, but weaker this time. I know, he smiled, remembering their conversation at the cafe. But I'd like to. Sophie, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly announced, This is just like in my drawing. When things get broken, you make them better and prettier than before. She looked up at her mother. Right, Mum. Lily's eyes met Ethan's over their daughter's head. Maybe you're right, sweetheart. Maybe sometimes things have to fall apart before they can become something new. Outside, the rain began to ease, and a shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds, catching on the damaged sculptures and creating unexpected patterns on the walls. Ethan found himself thinking about David's accusation, about questioning direction and changing markets. Looking at the way Lily was already beginning to reimagine her broken pieces into new forms, at Sophie's absolute faith in the possibility of making things better, he realized that some questions didn't need answers. Sometimes they just needed courage to explore where they might lead. The temporary gallery space in Ethan's building hummed with activity. What had been an empty retail shell 2 days ago was transforming into something extraordinary, though not without cost. Ethan's phone had 17 missed calls from David, and his inbox was overflowing with increasingly urgent emails about the corporate project. But watching Lily direct the placement of her salvaged and reimagined sculptures, he couldn't bring himself to regret his choice. She moved through the space with renewed energy, the devastation of the flood channeled into creative determination. What do you think about this angle? She asked, adjusting a piece that somehow seemed more beautiful for having been broken and reformed. The light hits it differently here. It works, he said, then smiled. Though my opinion might be slightly biased by the architect who designed those windows. Slightly, she laughed, the sound warming him more than he cared to admit. I've seen your original plans for this space. Remember, all those precise measurements and perfect symmetry. And now, she gestured around the room, where her organic flowing sculptures created an entirely new rhythm. Now it feels alive, like the space was waiting for something to wake it up. A crash from the back room interrupted them. Sorry, Sophie called out. The box was heavier than it looked. They found her surrounded by packing materials, looking sheepish. I was trying to help organize like Mr. Carter does, she explained, but everything got mixed up. Ethan knelt beside her. Want to know a secret? Sometimes mixed up is better. He picked up one of Lily's smaller pieces that had fallen. Look how the light plays through it now. We wouldn't have seen that if it was still packed away neatly. Sophie considered this seriously. Like Mum's new sculptures. They're different from before, but prettier now. Exactly. He helped her up, suddenly aware of Lily watching them with an unreadable expression. Sophie, honey, she said softly, why don't you go help Ms. Rosa set up the refreshments for tomorrow? She brought those special cookies you like. Once Sophie had bounded off, Lily turned to Ethan. You're good with her, really good. And you don't have to be. I'm not being anything, he replied, straightening a box more out of habit than necessity. She makes it easy. No, she doesn't. Sophie's been through a lot. After Ben, Lily took a deep breath. She stopped connecting with people, especially men. She'd put on a brave face, but there was always this distance. Until you. The weight of this confession hung between them. Ethan thought about his perfectly ordered life just weeks ago, how he would have run from this kind of emotional complexity. Now, standing among broken and remade art, he couldn't imagine being anywhere else. I should tell you something, he said finally. I'm probably going to lose the biggest project of my career because of the past few days. My partner, David... Oh, God, Ethan, no. Lily stepped back, horror crossing her face. You can't do that, not for us. We're not your responsibility. That's not... He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. I'm not doing this out of responsibility. The project, the one I'm probably losing, it's all wrong. It's just glass and steel and impressive numbers, dead space pretending to be alive. Understanding dawned in her eyes. Like my sculptures before the flood. Perfect, but not real. He gestured to the transformed gallery. This is real. Whatever's happening here, with the space, with Sophie, with us, she whispered. Before he could respond, Sophie's voice rang out. Mom, Mr. Carter, come quick. Ms. Rosa says there's a problem with the lighting. They found Rosa examining the track lighting with concern. The system's not working right. Something about the circuits, and we need proper lighting for tomorrow. I know someone, Ethan said, already pulling out his phone. He owes me a favor. No more favors, Lily interrupted firmly. I can't keep... Actually, Rosa interjected, I believe the favor in question was mine to call in. No, after that redesign you did for my cousin's restaurant last year. She winked at Lily. See, not everything is about you, dear. Lily's protest dissolved into laughter. Fine, but I'm helping with the installation. As they worked into the evening, Sophie set up a supervision station, complete with her drawing supplies and a steady stream of commentary on their progress. The gallery slowly came to life around them, each piece finding its place in the newly created ecosystem of light and shadow. Mom, Sophie called out eventually, I'm hungry and tired, and Mr. Carter looks tired too, even though he's trying to pretend he's not. Ethan realized she was right. He'd loosened his tie hours ago, rolled up his sleeves, and somehow forgotten about everything outside this space they were creating together. There's that Italian place around the corner, he suggested, then quickly added, if you're interested, both of you. Lily looked at her daughter, then back at him. We're a package deal, you know. It's not always going to be art fairs and magical transformations. Sometimes it's school meetings and nightmares and complicated questions about loss. I know. He met her gaze steadily. I'm not looking for simple. Sophie, who had been pretending not to listen, suddenly announced, Good, because Mom says I'm a beautiful complication. And you're kind of complicated too, Mr. Carter, even though you try to hide it behind your fancy ties. Lily burst out laughing. Out of the mouths of babes. As they locked up the gallery for the night, Ethan caught a glimpse of their reflection in the window, Sophie between them. All three of them slightly dusty and disheveled from the day's work. It looked nothing like the life he'd planned for himself. It looked better. The morning of the art fair brought chaos to the gallery. Collectors and critics filed through the space while Lily explained her work, her voice steady despite her nervousness. Ethan stood back, watching her shine in a way that made his chest tighten with pride, and something deeper he wasn't ready to name. Mr. Carter, Sophie tugged at his sleeve. That lady with the big red glasses keeps frowning at Mom's sculptures. Should we tell her she's looking at them wrong? He suppressed a smile. Sometimes people need time to understand new ideas. Your mom's work is different from what they're used to. Different is good, though, right? You said so yourself about the broken pieces. Before he could respond, a familiar voice cut through the crowd. So this is where you've been hiding. Ethan turned to find David standing there, impeccably dressed and radiating disapproval. I've been trying to reach you for days. The clients are furious about the redesign, and now I find you playing gallery curator. Sophie pressed closer to Ethan's side, suddenly quiet. He placed a protective hand on her shoulder. David, this isn't the time. When is the time? Our biggest project is falling apart because you're distracted by... David gestured around the gallery, his disdain palpable. What exactly? Some flood-damaged sculptures and a ready-made family. Is everything okay? Lily appeared beside them, her artist's composure cracking slightly as she sensed the tension. Sophie, why don't you go help Mrs. Rosa with the guest book? But Sophie stood her ground. He's being mean to Mr. Carter, she declared, glaring at David, and he doesn't understand about the broken pieces being beautiful. David's eyebrows shot up. Ethan, a word. Now, in a quiet corner of the gallery, David's control finally snapped. Have you lost your mind? You've worked your entire career for opportunities like this project, and you're throwing it away for what? Some widow and her kid. Their names are Lily and Sophie, Ethan said quietly, his own anger cold and precise. And they helped me see something I've been missing. Our buildings, David, they're perfect and empty. We design spaces that impress people but don't actually serve them. That's what pays the bills. That's what built this company. Maybe it's time to build something different. A commotion near the main sculptures drew their attention. One of the critics, the woman with the red glasses Sophie had noticed, was gesturing enthusiastically as she spoke to Lily. Other collectors had gathered around, and there was an energy in the air that felt like possibility. Unbelievable. David shook his head. You're really choosing this over everything we've worked for? I'm choosing to evolve. The question is, will you evolve with me? Mr. Carter, Sophie's voice carried across the gallery. Our mom's crying, but she says they're happy tears. The lady wants to show mom's work in her gallery. David watched as Ethan's face transformed at Sophie's words, at the sight of Lily wiping joyful tears while shaking hands with the critic. You're in love with them, he said, wonder and resignation mixing in his voice. The truth of it hit Ethan like a physical force. He was in love, not just with Lily, but with Sophie's boundless imagination, with the way they'd stumbled into his ordered life and rearranged everything into something more beautiful than he could have planned. The corporate project, David continued. They're meeting tomorrow to decide whether to continue with us. Last chance to fix this. I can't go back to designing dead spaces. Then don't. David's expression softened slightly. Mai, show them what you showed me just now, about buildings that serve people, not just impress them, but you have to be there to do it. Across the room, Lily was introducing Sophie to the critic, who was crouching down to admire Sophie's latest architectural drawing. The sight made Ethan's heart swell, even as anxiety crept in. The meeting was in Boston. He'd have to leave tonight to make it. I need to tell them, he said. Tell us what? Lily had appeared beside them, her cheeks flushed with excitement. Ethan, can you believe it? Charlotte Walsh wants to feature my work in her gallery. She says the way the pieces were transformed by the flood speaks to resilience and renewal, and... She stopped, finally registering the tension. What's wrong? Sophie slipped her hand into Ethan's. You're leaving, aren't you? I can tell because you have your worried architect face on. Just for a few days, he said quickly, watching Lily's expression close off. There's a meeting in Boston tomorrow morning. It's important for the firm, for our future. Lily's voice was carefully neutral. I have some new ideas about community-centered design. If they accept them, he took a deep breath. The studio space wouldn't have to be temporary. We could create something permanent, something that brings art and architecture together in a way that... That's not what I was asking about. Lily's eyes were bright with unshed tears. Go to Boston, Ethan. We'll be fine. We always are. Mom? Sophie started to protest. Honey, remember what we talked about not holding too tight to things that need to fly. Ethan felt like the ground was shifting beneath him. Lily, that's not what this is, isn't it? She smiled sadly. You have a life, a career. We can't ask you to reshape everything for us. It's not fair. I'm not... He stopped, realizing they'd drawn an audience. The remaining gallery visitors were pretending not to watch the drama unfolding in their midst. You should go pack, Lily said softly. You'll need time to prepare for tomorrow. She turned to the crowd, professional mask back in place. Thank you all for coming. The gallery will be open for another hour. Sophie's hand slipped from his, and she moved to stand beside her mother, small shoulders straight and proud despite the trembling of her lower lip. In that moment, she looked so much like Lily that Ethan's chest ached. David touched his arm. Cars waiting outside. We can make the evening flight if we leave now. Ethan looked at the transformed gallery space, at the broken pieces made whole in new ways, at the family he hadn't known he was looking for until they appeared in a mix-up of moving boxes. Everything in him screamed to stay, to explain, to make them understand that he wasn't flying away. He was trying to build them a nest, But Sophie's earlier words echoed in his head. Sometimes you have to let things fly. He just prayed they'd still be there when he landed. The Boston presentation room felt sterile after the warmth of the gallery. Ethan stood before the board of directors, his revised designs projected on the wall behind him, but his mind kept drifting to the family he'd left behind. "Mr. Carter," the CEO's voice cut through his thoughts. "You were saying about the community integration aspects." Ethan blinked, then looked at his carefully prepared slides. The corporate designs felt hollow now, even with his modifications. Without thinking, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out Sophie's drawing, the one with gardens growing between floors. "I'd like to show you something different," he said, holding up the crayon-colored paper. This was drawn by a 6-year-old girl who sees buildings not just as structures, but as living spaces that nurture communities. A murmur went through the room. David, sitting in the back, leaned forward with interest. "Our original design was impressive," Ethan continued, "but it was also isolating. What if instead—" He began to sketch on the conference room's whiteboard, his lines quick and sure. "What if we created spaces that grow with the people who use them?" Back in the city, Lily stood in the empty gallery space, running her fingers along the wall. The morning light caught her latest sculpture, a piece she'd created after Ethan left, made from the most damaged remnants of her flood-ruined work. She'd titled it "Flying Away." "Mom?" Sophie's voice echoed in the quiet room. "Can we go visit Mr. Carter's building today? Just to see if the gardens are okay?" Lily's heart clenched. "Honey, they're not real gardens. They were just drawings. But they could be real. Mr. Carter makes things real. He made your art space real when it got broken." In Boston, Ethan was on a roll. Each floor becomes its own ecosystem, connected by green spaces that improve air quality and employee well-being. The retail spaces at ground level open to public gardens, making the building part of the community rather than separate from it. "This is unexpected," the CEO said slowly. "It's certainly not what we originally discussed." "No," Ethan agreed. "It's better. It's alive." His phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from Rosa. "They miss you, both of them, even if they're too stubborn to say it." At the Bean Counter Cafe, Sophie sat at their usual table, working intently on a new drawing. Rosa watched from behind the counter, her heart heavy as she remembered the way Ethan used to lean over those drawings, asking questions that made Sophie's face light up. "What are you creating today, Pequeña?" she asked, placing a hot chocolate in front of Sophie. "It's a surprise," Sophie replied, not looking up. "For when Mr. Carter comes back." She paused, her crayon hovering over the paper. "He is coming back, right?" Rosa exchanged a glance with Lily, who was staring into her untouched coffee. "Sometimes," Rosa said carefully, "people need to fly away for a little while to remember where they belong." In the Boston boardroom, the presentation had ended. The directors were huddled together, speaking in low voices while Ethan waited, Sophie's drawing still in his hands. "Whatever they decide," David said quietly beside him, "you've changed things. Not just the design, the whole way we think about spaces." Ethan's phone buzzed again. A photo from Rosa this time. Sophie at their usual table, surrounded by drawings. His chest tightened when he noticed she was wearing the junior architect badge he'd made for her the day before he left. The CEO approached them, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Carter, this is not at all what we expected. I know, and I apologize if— Let me finish. It's not what we expected, but it's exactly what we needed." He extended his hand. "We'd like to move forward with your new vision. The community integration aspects, particularly the public spaces, they could revolutionize corporate architecture." Relief flooded through Ethan, followed immediately by an ache of longing. He should have felt triumphant. Instead, all he could think about was sharing the news with Lily and Sophie. "There's just one thing," the CEO continued. "We'd like you to oversee the project personally. That would mean relocating to Boston for at least a year during the initial phase." The world seemed to stop. Ethan looked at Sophie's drawing again, at the impossible gardens reaching toward the sky, at the tiny family she'd drawn enjoying them together. "I need some time to think about it," he said. Later, in his hotel room, Ethan sat surrounded by drawings. His architectural plans merged with Sophie's crayon visions, creating something entirely new. His phone showed 3 missed calls from David, probably about the Boston offer, and 1 text from Lily that made his heart stop. "Sophie asked if we could plant a garden for you to find your way back to us. I didn't know what to tell her." He picked up his phone, then put it down again. What could he say? That he'd achieved everything he'd spent his career working toward, but it felt meaningless without them. That he was terrified of making the wrong choice. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. It was David, looking unusually hesitant. "The board wants an answer by tomorrow morning," he said without preamble. "But before you decide, I think you should see this." He handed Ethan a tablet. On the screen was an article about the art fair, featuring Lily's work. The critic, Charlotte Walsh, had written about the transformative power of destruction and renewal, about finding beauty in broken things. But what caught Ethan's eye was the photo. Lily and Sophie standing among the sculptures, and in the background, barely visible, a drawing pinned to the wall. One of Sophie's garden buildings, but this time with a figure standing at its base, arms outstretched toward the family above. "Sometimes," David said quietly, "the biggest projects aren't the ones that look best on paper." Ethan stared at the photo, at the family he'd left behind, at the space between them that seemed to grow larger with every passing hour. He thought about gardens growing in impossible places, about boxes delivered to wrong addresses, about the way life sometimes broke things apart just to rebuild them stronger. He knew what he had to do. He just hoped he wasn't too late. 3 days after the Boston meeting, Lily stood in her new studio space, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes. Charlotte Walsh's gallery opening was in 2 weeks, and she needed to focus on preparing her pieces. Instead, she found herself staring at the wall of windows Ethan had been so proud of, watching the way sunlight painted patterns across the floor. "Mom?" Sophie's voice echoed in the vast space. "Can we put my drawing desk by the window? Like in Mr. Carter's building?" Lily swallowed hard. "Sure, honey, though maybe we should call it something else now." "Why? It's still his building, and he's still our Mr. Carter, even if he's in Boston." "Sophie," Lily started, but was interrupted by a commotion at the studio entrance. "Special delivery," Rosa's voice rang out. She entered carrying what appeared to be architectural plans, her eyes sparkling with barely contained excitement. "These just arrived at the cafe. I thought you might want to see them." Lily took the rolled papers hesitantly. "Rosa, if these are from Ethan, just open them," Rosa insisted, already shepherding Sophie over to look. The first sheet took Lily's breath away. It was a detailed architectural rendering of her studio space, but reimagined in a way that merged her artistic vision with Ethan's precision. Built-in display areas curved organically through the space, and the lighting system was designed to change with the sun's movement, creating different moods throughout the day. "Look," Sophie pointed to the margins. Alongside Ethan's professional notations were her own drawings, carefully integrated into the design. "He used my gardens!" The second sheet made Lily's hands tremble. It was a larger design, showing the entire building transformed. The empty retail spaces became a community art center, with studios, galleries, and workshop areas. And everywhere there were gardens, real ones, with detailed plans for installation and maintenance. "Turn it over," Rosa said softly. On the back, in Ethan's precise handwriting, "Some people design buildings, others make them come alive. I'm learning to do both, thanks to 2 remarkable teachers. P.S. Sophie, check the cafe's garden." The cafe's garden. Sophie was already running toward the door. "But there isn't." She stopped short at the entrance. There, in what had been an empty concrete patch beside the cafe, was a small garden. Plants in various stages of growth filled raised beds, and in the center stood a miniature version of one of Sophie's architectural designs, created in metal and serving as a trellis for climbing vines. "It's real," Sophie whispered. "Mom, the gardens are real." Lily heard footsteps behind her, familiar ones that made her heart race, even as she tried to steel herself against hope. "I had some help with the metalwork," Ethan's voice said quietly. "Turns out there's a talented sculptor in the building who specializes in transforming broken things into something beautiful." Lily turned slowly. He looked tired, his usual pristine appearance slightly rumpled, as if he'd been working through the night. Knowing Ethan, he probably had. "The Boston project," she managed to ask, "will be completed under the new design philosophy." He took a step closer. "But from here, David's taking lead in Boston. Turns out he's more adaptable than I gave him credit for. And," he ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as nervousness, "I've been thinking about what you said, about not asking someone to reshape their life. But what if reshaping is exactly what that life needed?" Sophie, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. "Does this mean you're staying? For real staying, not just until something breaks again?" Ethan knelt to her level. "Things will always break, Sophie. That's what makes the rebuilding so important. Like Mom's sculptures? Like everything." He looked up at Lily. "I had this perfect and ordered life planned out. Then some boxes got delivered to the wrong address, and suddenly all those perfect plans seemed empty. You both showed me that sometimes the most beautiful designs come from embracing the unexpected." "Ethan," Lily started, but her voice caught. "I'm not good at this," he continued quickly, "at family, at letting things be messy and unpredictable. But I want to learn, with you, both of you." He pulled out one more set of plans. "And if you'll help me build it." The design was for a home, one that combined his clean lines with spaces for art and gardens, quiet corners and open areas for family gatherings. In the margins, he'd left space for Sophie's additions. "It's just a preliminary design," he added nervously when neither of them spoke. "We can change anything that doesn't—" His words were cut off as Sophie crashed into him with a hug. Over her head, his eyes met Lily's, filled with questions and hopes and promises. "You know," Lily said, her voice wavering between laughter and tears, "for an architect, you can be remarkably slow to see what's right in front of you. Actually," he smiled, holding out his free arm to her, "I think I'm finally seeing clearly." As Lily stepped into their embrace, Sophie looked up with a serious expression. "Does this mean I can put more gardens in the design? Because I have ideas." "Of course you do," Ethan laughed, "though maybe we should start with the cafe garden. I hear it needs a junior architect's touch." Outside, the late afternoon sun caught the metal sculpture trellis, sending light dancing across the new garden. It wasn't perfect. Some plants were already straying from their designated spaces, and the overall effect was more organic than ordered. But as Ethan held his unexpected family, watching Sophie already plotting garden expansions while Lily's fingers intertwined with his, he realized that perfect wasn't what he'd been looking for after all. He'd been looking for home, and sometimes home came in unexpectedly delivered boxes, wrapped in crayon drawings and broken sculptures, waiting to be built into something extraordinary. The weeks leading up to Charlotte Walsh's gallery opening brought a new rhythm to their lives. Mornings began with coffee at the Bean counter, where Sophie had established what she called their family planning headquarters. A table covered in her drawings and Ethan's architectural sketches for their future home. But merging two distinct lives wasn't as simple as drawing new blueprints. "Oh, the contractor can start next month," Ethan said one morning, spreading timeline documents across their cafe table. "If we stick to the schedule, the house should be ready by—" "Next month," Lily looked up from her exhibition preparations. "Ethan, I can't even think about moving again until after the gallery opening. And Sophie's just settling into her new school routine. I know, but if we delay construction, we'll miss the optimal weather window for the garden installation." He pulled out a meticulously detailed Gantt chart. "See, if we move these milestones? Mr. Carter, Sophie interrupted, not looking up from her drawing, you're doing the thing again. The one where you try to make everything perfect and Mom gets that wrinkle between her eyebrows. Lily stifled a laugh as Ethan blinked, caught off guard by Sophie's observation. The girl had an uncanny ability to cut through tension with disarming honesty. I just want everything to be right for you both, he said quietly. We know. Lily reached across the table, covering his hand where it rested on the timeline. But we're not one of your buildings, Ethan. We don't need to be perfect. We just need to be together. The comment lingered with him throughout the day. In his office, surrounded by the precise lines and measurements that had always brought him comfort, Ethan found himself staring at a family photo Sophie had insisted on putting on his desk. It showed the three of them in the cafe garden, dirt on their clothes from planting new flowers, laughing at something now forgotten. His phone buzzed, a text from Lily. Emergency at Sophie's school. Can you get there? I'm stuck in a meeting with Charlotte. 20 minutes later, Ethan rushed into the school office to find Sophie sitting outside the principal's classroom, tears streaking her face. What happened? He asked, kneeling beside her. I got in trouble for arguing with Miss Henderson, Sophie sniffled. She said my story about a family living in a garden building was unrealistic. But it's not. We're going to do it. You made the drawings and everything. Ethan's heart twisted. Sophie. The principal's door opened, and Miss Henderson emerged with a stern expression. Mr. Carter, we were expecting Sophie's mother. He hesitated, suddenly uncertain of his role. I'm her mother's partner. Is there a problem? The parent-teacher conference that followed was a crash course in the complexities of their new reality. Yes, Sophie was incredibly creative. No, she hadn't been disruptive, just passionately defensive of her family's unconventional story. Yes, they were aware that transitions could be challenging for children. Perhaps, Mrs. Henderson suggested carefully, Sophie could benefit from some additional support during this adjustment period. Later, sitting in the bean counter with hot chocolate and Rosa's special emergency cookies, Sophie looked up at Ethan with red-rimmed eyes. Are you mad at me? No, sweetheart, never for standing up for what you believe in. But Ms. Henderson said, sometimes people don't understand families that look different from what they expect. He thought about his own journey, how his ordered worldview had been beautifully disrupted. But that doesn't make them any less real or important. Like Mom's sculptures, how they got more interesting after they broke. Exactly like that. When Lily arrived, breathless from rushing over after her meeting, she found them working on a new drawing together, a garden building that incorporated elements from Sophie's story, but with architectural details that made it structurally sound. I'm sorry I couldn't get here sooner, she said, watching them work. But what did I miss? Just some family engineering, Ethan replied, sharing a smile with Sophie. We're learning how to make impossible things possible. That evening, after Sophie was asleep, Lily found Ethan in his home office, surrounded by house plans and school brochures. You're overthinking again, she said softly. I just want to get it right. He ran a hand through his hair. Today at the school, when they asked who I was, Lily, what are we doing? Are we moving too fast, too slow? Should we be thinking about marriage, different schools? I don't know the rules for this. She moved behind him, wrapping her arms around his shoulders. There are no rules, Ethan. We're building something new, remember? Like my sculptures. Sometimes you have to let go of what you think it should be and see what it's becoming. He leaned back into her embrace, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Sophie called me Dad today, just for a moment, when she was excited about solving a design problem. She caught herself and went back to Mr. Carter. But how did it make you feel? Terrified, honored, like I was finally understanding what you meant about beautiful complications. Lily kissed his temple. Then maybe we're getting it exactly right, even if it's not perfect. Outside, the cafe garden bloomed in unexpected patterns, flowers straying from their designated beds to create new arrangements. Like their family, it was a work in progress, messy, unpredictable, and more beautiful for its imperfections. Later that night, as Ethan adjusted his usually rigid schedule to accommodate tomorrow's school art fair, Sophie's new story illustrated with architectural precision, he realized that perhaps the most perfect designs were the ones that knew how to bend without breaking. The night before Charlotte Walsh's gallery opening, Lily stood in her studio, making final adjustments to her sculptures. The space had evolved over the past weeks, with Sophie's drawings and Ethan's architectural sketches mingling with her work in progress. Their three distinct styles had begun to influence each other, her sculptures incorporating more structured elements, his designs growing more organic, Sophie's drawings bridging both worlds. "You're overthinking it," Ethan said from the doorway, echoing her frequent words to him. He carried 2 cups of Rosa's special blend coffee, a late-night tradition they'd developed, says the man who color-coded our kitchen cabinets. Lily teased, accepting the coffee gratefully. That was different. That was... He paused, catching her knowing look. "Okay, point taken." They stood in comfortable silence, studying the centerpiece of her exhibition, a large sculpture created from the most damaged pieces of her flood-ruined work, now transformed into something entirely new. The piece incorporated elements of Sophie's garden designs and subtle architectural influences that spoke to Ethan's impact on her artistic vision. "I never thought I'd create like this again," Lily said softly. "After Ben died, art was just something I did to keep going, for Sophie. But this," she gestured to the sculpture, "this feels like breathing again." Ethan wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her close. "Speaking of Sophie, she finally fell asleep, though not before making me promise we'd document every minute of tomorrow's opening for her art history research." Art history research. Apparently, she's decided to be an architect who designs art museums, but only ones with gardens. He smiled. "She's combining all of us into her future, like you did with this piece." Before Lily could respond, Ethan's phone buzzed. The caller ID showed David's name. "Take it," Lily encouraged. "I need to finish up here anyway." Ethan stepped into the hallway, but his voice carried back to her. "David, slow down. What do you mean Charlotte Walsh is bringing who to the opening?" Lily's hand stilled on her sculpture. She knew that tone in Ethan's voice, the one that meant carefully laid plans were about to collide with unexpected reality. He returned, looking pale. "The Boston clients? They're in town for a conference, and Charlotte invited them to the opening. Apparently, she thinks the synergy between your artistic vision and our new architectural direction could lead to some interesting collaborations." That's good, right? It's complicated. They're still not entirely sold on the community integration aspects of the design. If they see how personal this has become, how involved I am with... He trailed off, realizing how his words sounded. "With your inconvenient ready-made family." Lily's voice was carefully neutral. "Lily, no, that's not..." "Mom." Sophie appeared in the doorway, clutching her sketchbook. "I had the dream again." The tension dissolved instantly as they both turned to her. The dream, where she relived the day they lost Ben, had been coming less frequently, but still appeared in moments of stress or change. "Come here, sweetheart." Lily opened her arms, but Sophie went to Ethan instead, surprising them both. "Can you tell me about the gardens again, the ones we're going to build in our new house?" Ethan lifted her up, years of emotional walls crumbling at the simple trust in her request. "How about we add to the design? I think there's still some space near the kitchen that needs your touch." Over Sophie's head, his eyes met Lily's, filled with apology and understanding. This, their imperfect, beautiful family, was more important than any client's approval. Hours later, Sophie had fallen asleep on the studio's window seat, surrounded by new drawings. Ethan and Lily sat among the sculptures, adding final touches to tomorrow's layout. "I was scared," Ethan admitted quietly. Not of them knowing about us, but of not being enough. For the clients, for you and Sophie. You know what Ben used to say about fear." Lily picked up a small piece of twisted metal, turning it in the light. that it's just love holding its breath. Smart man. He would have liked you. She placed the metal piece into his hands. This was part of the first sculpture I made after he died. I could never quite place it in anything new until now. Ethan studied the piece, recognizing it as a crucial connection point in her centerpiece sculpture. Lily, everything that breaks us shapes us, she said softly. The flood, losing Ben, your perfectly ordered life getting mixed up with our chaos, it all becomes part of the design. He pulled her close, Sophie's gentle breathing providing a peaceful backdrop to their embrace. Tomorrow would bring its challenges. Critical eyes examining Lily's evolution as an artist, corporate minds judging Ethan's new direction, their unconventional family on display for all to see. But sitting there, surrounded by art that spoke of transformation and renewal, plans for their future home spread out beneath Sophie's dreaming form, they were exactly where they needed to be. They had built something stronger than career expectations or artistic acclaim. They had built a family. We should get her to bed, Lily whispered, looking at Sophie. In a minute, Ethan replied, holding them both closer. Sometimes, he was learning. The most important designs weren't the ones on paper, but the ones written in moments like these, in coffee cups and crayon drawings, in late-night conversations and healing hearts. In the window, their reflections blended with the city lights beyond, 3 distinct shapes becoming one unified whole, not perfect, but perfectly them. Charlotte Walsh's gallery hummed with anticipation. Lily's sculptures caught the carefully positioned lighting, casting intricate shadows that seemed to dance across the walls. The crowd included art critics, collectors, and, making Ethan's collar feel too tight, the entire board of directors from the Boston project. "Stop fidgeting," David murmured, appearing beside him with 2 glasses of champagne. "You look like you're facing a firing squad instead of celebrating your family's success." Our CEO keeps looking at the centerpiece sculpture, then at me, then back at the sculpture. I think he's making connections I'm not ready to explain. You mean he's noticing that your girlfriend's artistic philosophy about transformation through damage perfectly mirrors your new architectural vision? David smiled. How inconvenient. Before Ethan could respond, Sophie tugged at his sleeve. She wore a navy blue dress they'd chosen together, her usual creative energy temporarily contained by the formal occasion. "Dad," she whispered urgently, then caught herself. "I mean Mr. Carter. The important people are coming this way." Ethan's heart stuttered at her slip, but there was no time to dwell on it. Charlotte Walsh was indeed approaching, accompanied by the CEO and several board members. "Ah, Mr. Carter." Charlotte's voice carried the authority of someone used to shaping cultural conversations. "I was just explaining to your clients how Ms. Bennett's work exemplifies the very principles you've incorporated into their project, the integration of broken elements to create something more meaningful than the original. It's quite revolutionary in both mediums." The CEO studied Ethan with new interest. "Is that where you found your inspiration for the community integration aspects from Ms. Bennett's artistic process?" Ethan felt Lily step up beside him, her presence both comforting and nerve-wracking. This was the moment to be diplomatic, to maintain professional distance. Instead, he found himself saying, "Actually, I found it in a wrongly delivered box, and a little girl who saw gardens where I only saw structures." Sophie beamed up at him, all traces of formality forgotten. "Show them my drawings, the ones we used for the new house." "New house?" Charlotte's eyebrows rose with interest. Lily squeezed Ethan's hand, a silent show of support as he pulled out his tablet. "We're combining our design philosophies in a personal project. Sophie's our lead creative consultant." To everyone's surprise, the CEO laughed. "Now I understand. You're not just theorizing about integrated community spaces and organic growth, you're living it." He turned to Charlotte. "Did you know our original design was all glass and steel? Cold, impressive, but soulless. Then Mr. Carter here shows up with children's drawings and starts talking about gardens between floors." "The gardens were my idea," Sophie announced proudly. "But Dad, Mr. Carter made them actually work. Mom says that's what he does best, makes impossible things possible. The slip felt natural this time, barely noticed in the flow of conversation. Ethan caught Lily's eye, saw the happy tears she was trying to blink back. Perhaps, Charlotte suggested, we should discuss a collaborative installation. Something that combines Ms. Bennett's sculptural elements with Mr. Carter's architectural vision. The gallery has been looking for ways to engage with the community more directly. As the conversation evolved into a lively discussion of possibilities, Ethan felt a tug on his heart that had nothing to do with professional opportunities. Sophie had moved to stand between him and Lily, one hand held by each, forming their own small triangle of strength in the crowded gallery. Later, after the critics had praised and the collectors had purchased and the Boston board had enthusiastically greenlit the project's next phase, the three of them stood alone in the gallery. Sophie had finally succumbed to exhaustion, sleeping on a bench while Lily and Ethan looked at the centerpiece sculpture one last time before transport. "Did you notice?" Lily asked softly. She stopped correcting herself. "When she called you Dad, I noticed." His voice was rough with emotion. Are you okay with that?" Lily turned to him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Ben will always be her father. But you, Ethan Carter, have built your own place in her heart, in both our hearts." She touched the sculpture gently. "Sometimes love isn't about replacing what was lost. It's about creating something new from what remains, like a garden growing between floors. Like a family growing between broken pieces." She smiled. "Sophie was right, you know. You do make impossible things possible." "Not alone," he said, drawing her close. "Some designs require multiple architects." They stood there, holding each other in the quiet gallery, their shadows merging with those cast by the sculpture. Through the windows, they could see the cafe garden, now lush and thriving despite breaking free of its original planned layout. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, contracts to negotiate, spaces to design, a house to build. But tonight, watching Sophie sleep peacefully amid the physical manifestations of their combined creativity, they had everything they needed. "Take me home," Lily whispered. "Which one?" Ethan asked, thinking of her apartment, his condo, the house under construction. "Any of them, all of them." She kissed him softly. "Home is where we are together." As if on cue, Sophie stirred, blinking sleepily. "Did all the important people like our art?" Ethan lifted her into his arms, feeling her head settle trustingly against his shoulder. The most important ones did. Looking at his family, at the art they'd created together, both physical and emotional, Ethan understood finally that the most beautiful designs weren't the ones that went according to plan. They were the ones that dared to grow wild, to break apart and reform, to find strength in their very imperfections. 1 year later, Ethan stood in the garden of their new home, watching the morning sun paint shadows through the climbing vines. The house had turned out nothing like his original plans. It was better. Every room told the story of their journey. Sophie's art studio connecting to his home office through a greenhouse walkway. Lily's sculpture workshop opening onto a courtyard where her pieces caught the changing light. Spaces that flowed into each other like water finding its natural course. "Dad, the moving truck is here." Sophie's voice carried from the front yard. She'd stopped correcting herself months ago, the word becoming as natural as breathing. The last of their boxes were being delivered today, a fact that made them all smile at the memory of that first mixed-up delivery that had started everything. "Should we check the address this time?" Lily teased, joining him in the garden. Her hand slipped naturally into his, a gesture so familiar now he couldn't remember how he'd lived without it. "I don't know," he replied, pulling her close. The last delivery mistake worked out pretty well." From inside, they heard Sophie giving detailed instructions to the movers about the proper placement of her architectural drafting table, a birthday gift from Ethan that had brought tears to Lily's eyes. "She's definitely your daughter," Lily laughed. "I heard her explaining the importance of proper light angles to her art teacher yesterday. And then she proceeded to completely ignore all traditional color theory in her painting, just like her mother. The sound of Rosa's voice joined Sophie's. Their cafe owner friend had become family over the past year, and her garden-warming gift of special coffee beans and Sophie's favorite cookies sat waiting in the kitchen. "Did you ever imagine this?" Lily asked softly. "A year ago, when you were planning your perfect, predictable life?" Ethan thought about the man he'd been, so focused on controlling every detail that he'd almost missed the chance to build something truly extraordinary. "Actually," he smiled, "I had it all mapped out. Step 1, deliver boxes to wrong address. Step 2, fall in love with amazing artist and her brilliant daughter. Step 3, completely redesign my entire life and career around gardens and family and beautiful chaos." Ah, yes. It was obviously all part of your master plan. Their playful moment was interrupted by David's arrival. He carried a large presentation portfolio and wore the excited expression that had become familiar since their firms had merged, combining Ethan's community-centered vision with David's business acumen. "The Boston project's final renderings," he announced. "And wait until you see the proposals we're getting since the Charlotte Walsh installation opened. Everyone wants the Bennett Carter design philosophy." "The what?" Lily asked. "That's what they're calling it in the architectural journals, the integration of artistic vision and community-centered design. You two are becoming quite the power couple in the industry." Before either could respond, Sophie burst into the garden, waving a paper. "Mom! Dad! Look what I found in one of the boxes!" It was her original drawing of the garden building, the one she'd made the day of the box mix-up. The crayon lines were faded, but the vision was clear. A place where nature and structure worked together, where a family could grow and thrive. "We should frame it," Lily suggested. "Hang it somewhere special." "I know where," Ethan said. He led them to the heart of the house, where the main living space opened to the garden through walls of windows. A single empty space waited on the central wall, perfectly sized for Sophie's drawing. As they hung it together, each adding their own artistic touch to the arrangement, Ethan felt the rightness of the moment settle into his bones. This was what he'd been trying to design all along, not just a house or a career, but a life rich with love and creativity and, yes, even a little chaos. "Oh," Sophie suddenly exclaimed, "I almost forgot. Ms. Rosa brought the special cookies. Race you to the kitchen." As she darted away, Lily turned to Ethan. "You know, for someone who used to hate unexpected changes, you've gotten pretty good at embracing them. I had excellent teachers." He pulled her into a kiss, soft and familiar, and still somehow thrilling. "Though I do have one more planned change, if you're interested." "Oh," he reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small box, not delivered to the wrong address this time, but chosen with precise care and perfect certainty. "And to Lily Bennett," he started, but she was already crying and laughing at once. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, to more changes, to more adventures, to building whatever comes next. Together." "Mom! Dad! The cookies are getting cold," Sophie called. "Together sounds perfect." Ethan smiled, slipping the ring onto her finger. "Should we tell her now?" "Are you kidding? She probably designed our wedding gardens months ago." Hand in hand, they walked toward their kitchen, toward Sophie, toward their future. Through the windows, the garden beckoned, not perfectly manicured, but wild and wonderful, and completely their own, just like the family that had grown from a simple mix-up of boxes, proving that sometimes the best designs aren't the ones we plan, but the ones we discover when life delivers something unexpected to our door. In his office, Ethan's original plans for a simple, decontrolled life gathered dust in a drawer. Above his desk hung a different design, Sophie's first drawing, where gardens grew between floors and a family found their way home. It wasn't the life he'd thought he wanted. It was infinitely better. The end. That was a beautiful story, wasn't it? I hope you enjoyed it. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your collaboration is very important to me.